In the pouring rain, a scared little girl hugged herself for warmth, hiding from someone she feared. Seeing her there, the CEO stepped out of his car, drawn by her silent plea. "Please, just take me away," she whispered. In that instant, both their lives changed course forever. Ethan Callahan sat alone in his penthouse, high above the city, surrounded by a world most people only dreamed of. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of San Francisco, a glittering maze of city lights, bridges, and neon. Yet all that shimmer felt impossibly far away. Inside, the only sounds were the faint hum of the building's air conditioning system, the insistent ticking of a brushed steel clock, and the muted drone of distant traffic far below. On the coffee table lay a single, pale gold wedding band. He had taken it off months ago, but the skin beneath still bore its mark, a ghost of what he once was. Sometimes, when he looked at himself reflected in the black glass, he saw nothing but exhaustion in his eyes and the rigid mask he wore for the world. It was the look of someone who had it all, yet found himself drowning in silence. He moved through his immaculate home with the absent grace of a man living on autopilot. The kitchen was a museum of stainless steel and glass, untouched by real life. He made himself a cup of coffee, extra strong, jet black, as bitter as the ache that lived in his chest. He took one sip and grimaced. The coffee was cold already, or maybe it was just him. With a sigh, he wandered into the living room, his gaze drifting over framed awards, abstract art, and a single photo from a life before. A woman's laughter, a sunset, the hope that things could last. The emptiness pressed in on him, as heavy as the city's fog. He rubbed his eyes, trying to chase away the memory of what this place used to feel like when it was alive. Rain began to streak the windows, the city below blurred by a curtain of water. Ethan checked the time. Already past midnight. He should have gone to bed, but the thought of lying awake in the dark, listening to the hush of his own regrets, was too much. He grabbed his coat and headed out, letting the elevator's silence swallow him whole. The lobby was deserted, the doorman dozing, as Ethan stepped out into the heart of the storm. Driving through the city at night, he felt like a ghost gliding between the rain-splattered neon and the winking taillights. He barely noticed the usual landmarks: the sushi place, the little bookstore he never visited, the park where lovers sheltered beneath umbrellas. Everything was muted, as if the world were wrapped in cotton. He turned onto a quieter street, the wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour, when something jolted him, something small and out of place. His foot slammed on the brakes, the car skidding slightly. Heart pounding, he peered through the windshield and saw her. A little girl, no more than 7, barefoot and shivering beneath a flickering street lamp. She was hunched over, her knees drawn up, a battered backpack pressed to her chest. Her hair was plastered to her face, her thin jacket soaked through. For a moment, Ethan thought she was a ghost, a trick of the light and rain. But then she looked up, and their eyes met. Everything in him sharpened at once. The world's sounds fell away, replaced by the hammering of his own pulse. The rain pounded on the roof, headlights glared harshly against the pavement, and the metallic taste of adrenaline filled his mouth. He saw in her eyes not just fear, but a depth of pain and desperation so raw it struck him physically. A sharp, twisting ache under his ribs. It was a look that said she had seen too much, that she was beyond tears. Ethan felt his breath catch, his body moving before his mind could argue. He pulled over, barely registering the icy spray of rain as he stepped into the night, umbrella forgotten in the car. He approached her slowly, careful not to spook her. Up close, the girl was smaller than he'd thought. Her lips blue with cold, her hands shaking as she clutched her backpack. She watched him with huge, haunted eyes, the kind that made him feel suddenly, painfully helpless. He knelt down, trying to make his voice gentle, though it trembled with something he hadn't felt in years. "Are you lost? Where's your family?" he asked, searching her face for some sign of hope. She didn't answer at first. She just shrank back a little, as if expecting to be hurt. Then, in a voice so thin he almost missed it, she whispered, "No family. Please, don't let him find me. Just take me away. Please." The words were so desperate, so final, they broke something open in Ethan's chest. He didn't think, didn't calculate risks, didn't weigh what might happen next. He just knew he couldn't leave her there. Not in this city, not in this storm, not ever. Gently he offered his hand, hoping she would take it. For a long, fragile second, she stared at it. Then, with trembling fingers, she reached out. The connection was electric, a current running through both of them. As Ethan led her toward his car, shielding her from the worst of the rain, he felt the full weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders. He didn't know who she was, or what haunted her, or what price he would pay for getting involved. All he knew was that he couldn't walk away. Not tonight. Not anymore. They drove off into the city, the rain erasing their tracks, two lonely souls bound by a moment that would change everything. Ethan drove through the rain-drenched streets with the girl huddled beside him in the passenger seat, the car's heater blowing hot air that barely seemed to touch her trembling shoulders. For a while, silence pressed between them, thick as the fog that clung to the windows. Ethan's mind raced. He was a man who thrived on control, who scheduled his life in 15-minute increments, who trusted only in logic and contracts. Yet here he was, driving through the heart of the night with a soaking wet child, a stranger, shivering in his car. With each passing minute, the unreality of the situation clawed at him. What am I doing, he wondered, fingers drumming the steering wheel. Why didn't I call the police? Why am I risking everything for a little girl I don't know? But every time his mind circled back to those questions, he glanced at her and saw the way she pressed herself into the seat, as if trying to disappear, clutching her battered backpack like a life raft. He couldn't bring himself to leave her, not after what he'd seen in her eyes. The neon sign of a late-night diner flickered through the rain. Ethan pulled into the small parking lot and cut the engine. "Let's go inside," he said gently, but the girl didn't move. "It's warm in there, and you can have something to eat." She hesitated, eyeing the door like it might bite, then finally nodded, sliding out of the seat when he opened her door. Inside, the diner glowed with fluorescent light, cheap, cheerful, and a world apart from Ethan's usual haunts. The smell of coffee and frying bacon hung in the air. A few other patrons sat scattered at tables, hunched over their plates, lost in their own midnights. Ethan guided the girl to a booth in the back, away from the windows. She slid in, curling into herself, eyes darting warily. He shrugged off his coat and sat opposite her, fighting the urge to check his phone. Instead, he flagged down the waitress, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and silver streaks in her hair. She approached with a notepad, her gaze flicking from Ethan's expensive shirt to the drenched, trembling child across from him. But she didn't ask questions. Instead, she offered a small, understanding smile. "What can I get you to tonight?" she asked quietly. Ethan hesitated. Just maybe some hot chocolate and a grilled cheese. Whatever's easiest. The waitress nodded. Without missing a beat, she brought over an extra plate with a giant chocolate chip cookie and set it in front of the girl, along with a steaming mug of cocoa. "She looks like she needs this," she said softly to Ethan. "Let me know if you need anything else." Her gentle, no-questions approach seemed to ease something in the girl. She wrapped both hands around the mug, the heat making her wince. But she didn't let go. Slowly, she began to sip, color returning to her cheeks. She nibbled the cookie, small bites, as if uncertain when she'd next have the chance. Ethan tried not to stare, but he couldn't help it. Every detail, her raw knuckles, the old bruise on her wrist, the way she kept glancing at the door, added to his growing sense of unease. He wondered, for a brief moment, if he should have called the authorities after all. But when he opened his mouth to speak, the words died on his tongue. He watched her instead, fighting the war inside himself, part of him desperate to keep his distance, the other part aching to reach across the table and promise her the world. The diner's warmth wrapped around them, muting the storm outside. After a few minutes, the girl looked up, her eyes meeting his for the first time since they'd left the street. There was something in her gaze now, less fear, more curiosity, maybe even the faintest glimmer of hope. "Do you have a name?" Ethan asked quietly, not wanting to push. She hesitated, eyes flicking toward the waitress, then back to her cocoa. "Sophie," she whispered, so softly he almost missed it. "Sophie," he repeated, letting the name settle in the air. It suited her, delicate, unassuming, but with a hidden strength. "I'm Ethan." She nodded, clutching the mug tighter. They sat in silence for a while, Ethan watching the rain chase itself down the glass, Sophie picking at the edge of the cookie. He wondered what she was thinking. Was she afraid he'd send her away? Did she regret trusting him? He tried to recall what it felt like to be so small, so lost, but all he could remember was the heaviness of his own loneliness. Maria, the waitress, returned with their order and slid the plate in front of Sophie. She didn't say a word, just offered another smile before moving on to her other tables. Sophie nibbled at the sandwich, her movements tentative, as if expecting it to be snatched away at any moment. Ethan's chest tightened. He watched as she slowly relaxed, her shoulders dropping an inch, her breathing slowing. This was the first time he'd seen her do anything but shiver. Finally, after a long, fragile silence, Sophie spoke, her voice barely more than a breath. "He said if I told, he'd hurt me." Like the others, she hesitated, glancing around the diner before whispering, "They called him Mr. Green. He always wore a ring with a green stone." The words hung between them, cold and heavy. Ethan felt something twist inside him, a protective urge so fierce it frightened him. He realized then that it was no longer just about doing the right thing. It was about this girl, about Sophie, and about the promise he felt growing in his heart, whether he wanted it or not. Ethan swallowed, choosing his words with care. "No one's going to hurt you while you're with me, Sophie. I promise." Even as he said it, he knew he was stepping over an invisible line, making a commitment he could never take back. For the first time, Sophie looked at him, not through him, not past him, but directly into his eyes. And in that fleeting moment, something changed. Trust, fragile and flickering, had begun to take root. The rain eased outside, but inside, something entirely new was starting, a connection neither of them could have imagined. the first fragile step on a road that would change both their lives forever. The rain had settled into a relentless drizzle by the time Ethan and Sophie left the diner, but a chill still clung to the city's bones. Ethan walked with Sophie pressed close to his side, feeling her tense with every passing car and flicker of headlights. He tried to reassure her with small talk, but she barely spoke, her gaze fixed on the puddles as if she could disappear into them. Ethan's phone buzzed. A message from Rick Monroe, his head of security. "On my way. 10 minutes." The words were meant to comfort, but they only reminded Ethan how unprepared he felt. Until now, his world had been measured in deals and deadlines, never in threats that couldn't be managed by a contract or a call to legal. But looking at Sophie's haunted face, he knew he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't control. As they reached the parking lot, Sophie suddenly froze. Her grip tightened around his hand, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't look. Please." "The black van. It's his, Mr. Green's van," she breathed. Ethan followed her gaze and saw, parked across the street, a dark vehicle with its engine idling, exhaust curling into the air. The hair on the back of his neck stood up. He guided Sophie quickly to his car and locked the doors. As he pulled out, he checked the rearview mirror. The van was still there, unmoving, its headlights two cold, unblinking eyes. Back at his high-rise, Ethan drove straight into the private garage. He ushered Sophie into the service elevator, using a back entrance only a handful of people knew existed. When the doors opened to his penthouse, Sophie's jaw tightened. The soaring ceilings, cold glass, and curated art offered no comfort. Instead, the vast emptiness only magnified her smallness. Ethan set her on the couch and wrapped a thick blanket around her, then busied himself making tea he knew she wouldn't drink. He kept glancing at the door, waiting for Rick. When Rick arrived, a tall man with a shaved head and the steady calm of someone who'd seen everything, he took one look at Sophie and softened his voice. "Evening, boss." "This her?" Sophie recoiled, shrinking into the corner, fear etched deep in her eyes. Rick noticed and immediately kept his distance, addressing Ethan instead. "You want a background check run, or are we calling the cops?" Ethan's hands shook as he explained the night. The girl, the van, the terror that clung to her every move. Rick listened, his face growing more serious by the second. "You know how many kids go missing in this city every year?" Rick asked, voice low. "Most of them, nobody looks twice. And if there's a van, and she knows it, this is bad, Ethan. Real bad." It was then that Ethan felt the first true crack in his armor. He'd always believed his money could insulate him from anything. Now, sitting on the edge of his expensive leather sofa, he felt powerless. The penthouse, usually a symbol of his strength, felt suddenly exposed, like a glass box. He looked at Sophie, clutching her blanket, eyes flickering from Rick to the windows, every muscle ready to run. He wondered if she'd ever truly feel safe. Rick started working, pulling up security feeds and setting up alerts. He scrubbed through the garage cameras and froze the frame on a rear plate. "Got it," he said. "We have the tag." Ethan hovered beside him, heart pounding with every grainy camera angle. Outside, the city glittered indifferently, unaware of the storm gathering in this one beautiful room. A sudden movement on the security screen caught everyone's attention, the same black van circling the block. Rick was already on the phone with San Francisco Police Department. Marked units would sit on the block overnight. 2 officers took posts in the lobby and garage until further notice. Sophie's panic ignited. "That's him. That's the man," she whispered, breath hitching. She pressed herself deeper into the couch, as if trying to disappear. Ethan knelt down, his own fear and frustration bubbling over. "You're safe now," he said, but the words sounded weak even to him. He felt helpless, more helpless than any business negotiation, more than any loss he'd suffered before. There was no deal to make here, no solution to buy. He was facing something raw and evil, something his world had never prepared him for. Rick's tone was grim. "We'll tighten security. Nobody gets in or out without me knowing. But Ethan, this is way bigger than you think." Ethan nodded, mind racing. For the first time in his life, he realized he couldn't protect someone with wealth or reputation alone. That realization hit him like a punch in the gut. His world, his fortress, meant nothing if he couldn't keep this terrified child safe. As the city settled into uneasy silence, Ethan walked to the window, looking out over the lights. He felt rage at the people who'd hurt Sophie, rage at himself for ever thinking he was untouchable, and a helplessness that nearly brought him to his knees. He promised himself, quietly and fiercely, that he would do whatever it took, that he would risk it all, if that's what she needed. Behind him, Sophie finally slept, curled up under the blanket, the tension in her small body never fully leaving. Rick kept watch at the door, scanning the feeds for any sign of the van. Ethan sat alone for a long time, letting the truth settle. His world was forever changed, and he would never be able to walk away. The sun barely crested the skyline when Ethan woke on the living room couch. The unfamiliar ache in his neck, nothing compared to the heavy sense of responsibility that now lived in his chest. Sophie was still asleep, curled in a protective knot at the other end of the sofa, clutching her backpack like a shield. He watched her for a moment, marveling at the fragility and strength contained in one small, battered child. The previous night felt both unreal and terrifyingly immediate. For the first time in years, Ethan's first waking thought wasn't about meetings or markets. It was about whether Sophie would feel safe enough to eat breakfast. Moving quietly, he made his way to the kitchen, flipping on lights that felt far too harsh for the hour. He rummaged for ingredients: eggs, bread, butter, his hands uncertain, movements clumsy. It struck him that he hadn't cooked for anyone in a decade, not since his wife had passed away. But this morning, the stakes felt different. Each act, no matter how small, felt significant. An act of care in a world that had shown Sophie so little of it. When the scent of toast finally drew Sophie from sleep, Ethan greeted her with a cautious smile. "Morning. You hungry?" She nodded, eyes still wary, and settled at the counter while he made a plate. He set it down gently, careful not to crowd her, watching as she picked at the food with hesitant gratitude. It was a small victory, one that left Ethan feeling strangely emotional. His phone buzzed. The board meeting he was supposed to chair would start in 20 minutes. He glanced at Sophie, remembered the way she had flinched from Rick the night before, and made a decision. With steady fingers, he typed a message. "Family emergency. I'm out today." There would be questions, but he no longer cared. For the first time, someone else's safety mattered more than his own reputation. Rick, who had camped out in the guest room, appeared in the doorway, his face drawn but alert. "Security's tight. I've got my guys watching the garage and all entry points. Nothing gets through." He gave Sophie a reassuring nod. "You doing okay, kid?" Sophie managed a tiny smile, and Ethan felt a pang of hope. Later that morning, Sophie wandered into Ethan's office while he was reviewing security footage. She held a crumpled piece of paper, her hands shaking slightly as she offered it to him. It was a drawing, her small and alone, surrounded by faceless figures looming at the edge of the page. She'd drawn herself inside a box, lines dark and desperate, as if the act of drawing were both a cry for help and a way to process her fear. Ethan crouched to her level, his voice soft but strong. "You're safe here. I promise." His hands trembled as he said it, understanding the weight of his words for the first time in his life. This was no empty gesture. This was a vow. Determined to do more, Ethan reached out to Agent Riley at the FBI's Child Protection Division, explaining Sophie's situation and the lurking threat of the black van. Within hours, Riley called back. "A LPR hit on that plate." She added, "The logo Sophie sketched matches an old Atlas cold storage warehouse on the outskirts." He gave details: his name, his address, his willingness to cooperate in any way possible. He knew the call might bring scrutiny or risk, but he didn't hesitate. If there was a way to keep Sophie safe and to protect other kids like her, he would do it. The hours passed in a rhythm that felt almost like normal life. Ethan read Sophie stories, finding children's books he'd long forgotten in the back of a closet. He waited with her until she fell asleep for a midday nap, her breathing slow and even for the first time. When she woke, he made her a sandwich and let her choose a cartoon to watch on the giant living room TV. Each small act became a thread in the fragile web of trust, slowly weaving between them. But even as the day unfolded, the shadow of danger never quite left. Rick brought in extra security staff, reviewing badge IDs and cross-checking faces against the feed. Ethan watched the monitors obsessively, jaw clenched every time an unfamiliar car slowed near the building. Still, Sophie seemed calmer, her eyes less frantic, her shoulders less rigid. She began to ask quiet questions. "Will the bad man find me here? What happens if I have a nightmare?" Each time Ethan answered honestly, "You're safe. I'll be here. You don't have to be alone anymore." As dusk settled, Agent Riley arrived, her presence both official and reassuring. She knelt to Sophie's level, introducing herself with a badge and a warm smile. "You're very brave, Sophie." "I'm here to help Sophie look to Ethan for reassurance before answering questions in a whisper." The trust was fragile but growing, and Agent Riley handled her with care. That night, as Ethan tucked Sophie into the guest bed, she handed him the crumpled drawing again. "You can keep it," she said, "so you remember." He knelt beside her, promising, "I won't forget." Not ever. He waited by her side until she drifted to sleep, feeling a profound sense of purpose, a certainty that, whatever it cost, he would see this through. Long after the apartment went quiet, Ethan sat alone, reviewing the day's events. He realized he had sacrificed more than a meeting. He had risked his reputation, his safety, and his carefully constructed life. But as he looked at the drawing, the small, frightened girl he had sworn to protect, he knew there was no other choice. For the first time in years, Ethan Callahan understood what it meant to truly care. Days began to pass, with an unfamiliar softness in Ethan's penthouse, as if the old, sterile air had been replaced with something lighter, almost warm. Every morning started with the small but profound ritual of making breakfast for two. Sometimes Sophie would help, standing on a chair at the kitchen counter, her tiny hands sprinkling blueberries into pancake batter. The first time she smiled at him, flour smudged on her cheek, eyes sparkling with cautious delight. Ethan felt something inside him shift, a tension he'd carried for years quietly releasing. The sound of her laughter, quick and bubbling, echoed through rooms that had been silent for far too long. For Ethan, each moment of this new daily life felt at once foreign and familiar, like a song he'd once known but forgotten how to sing. He caught himself humming as he made coffee, or pausing just to watch Sophie as she curled up on the sofa, engrossed in a storybook. He found her drawings everywhere now, on the refrigerator, on scraps of paper scattered across his office, even on the bathroom mirror where she'd used a dry erase marker to draw a sun with a crooked smile. These small, bright explosions of color transformed his home from a place of echoing emptiness to a living, breathing space. As the days blended, Sophie grew bolder. She asked Ethan about the photos in his hallway. Who was the woman with the kind eyes? Why did he look so different in old pictures? What was it like to be so tall? He answered honestly, telling her about his late wife, about a time before the weight of loneliness, about the happiness he'd almost forgotten. Sometimes, late at night, he caught himself talking aloud to the shadows, as if explaining to the woman in the photos that everything was changing again, that he was letting someone in. Maria, the waitress from the diner, became a regular visitor. She dropped by with stacks of children's books, puzzles, and homemade cookies. The first time Maria came, Sophie hid behind Ethan, uncertain and shy. But Maria simply knelt to her level and said, "You have the best smile I've ever seen. Mind if I borrow it for a while?" Soon, Maria and Sophie were curled on the living room floor, reading aloud, their voices tumbling over each other in laughter. Ethan watched, deeply grateful. He realized that what Sophie needed most was not just safety, but a sense of belonging, a network of gentle, steady presences to make her believe the world could be kind. Even Rick, who always seemed out of place in a luxury penthouse, became an unlikely source of comfort. He brought Sophie a sturdy new backpack and taught her how to plant a tiny flower in a pot on the balcony. "Tough little thing," he said, pressing soil around the roots. "Just like you. Needs sunlight, water, and someone who won't give up on it." Sophie named the flower Hope. Ethan thought it was perfect. Yet, despite all these moments of growth, healing was not a straight line. There were nights when Sophie woke screaming, tangled in sweat-soaked sheets, eyes wide with terror. Ethan would rush to her side, murmuring soft reassurances, holding her until her heartbeat slowed. Sometimes she would cry herself hoarse, repeating, "Don't let them take me," until her voice faded and sleep returned. Those nights left Ethan exhausted, but also more determined. Each nightmare a reminder that real safety took time to earn. One morning, while cleaning up after another flour-dusted breakfast, Ethan caught a glimpse of himself in the hallway mirror. He barely recognized the man looking back. Softer lines, a trace of a real smile, eyes no longer empty but full of purpose. He realized he was no longer just managing a life of numbers and deadlines. He was living, truly living, for the first time in years. Sophie began to trust him in small, precious ways. She asked if she could help set the table, or if he would read her a bedtime story, sometimes the same story 3 times in a row. She even started leaving her backpack in the hall instead of carrying it from room to room. Ethan took this as a sign. The fortress of fear she'd built around herself was slowly, gently being dismantled. Agent Riley and Rick became a second circle of support. Riley visited every few days, checking on Sophie's well-being, bringing coloring books and gentle questions. She never pushed, but always left the door open for Sophie to share, in her own time, what she had endured. Rick organized a movie night, bringing pizza and a stack of old comedies. Sophie fell asleep halfway through, curled against Ethan's side, a slice of pizza abandoned on her plate. The penthouse changed, almost imperceptibly, day by day. The silence was broken by the sound of cartoons, by the splash of bathwater, by laughter echoing down marble halls. Ethan's life, once ruled by isolation and regret, was becoming a place of hope and almost impossibly joy. And with every story, every new drawing on the fridge, every smile from Sophie, he realized he was being healed as well. One evening, as twilight painted the city in soft gold, Sophie looked up from her drawing and asked, "Do you think I can stay here forever?" Ethan felt his throat tighten. He knelt beside her, brushing a lock of hair from her eyes. "You can stay as long as you want, Sophie. As long as you need." Her smile, bright and shy, was all the answer he needed. He knew then, deep in his bones, that his life would never go back to the way it was. And for the first time, that felt like a blessing. It began with a single, fragile thread of hope. One morning, as sunlight flooded Ethan's penthouse, Agent Riley arrived with news. The FBI had tracked the mysterious black van to a remote warehouse on the city's outskirts. Sophie's trembling drawings, maps, windows, the terrifying shape of a padlocked door matched the location. Ethan's heart pounded as he listened, torn between fear for Sophie and the desperate urge to see things through. He insisted on coming. "You're not leaving me behind," he told Riley, voice firm in a way that left no room for argument. That evening, as rain returned to lash the city, Ethan found himself pulling on a borrowed bulletproof vest in the cramped back room of a police command van. The world outside felt on edge, nerves thrumming with electricity. Radios crackled. Agents whispered. Rick was there too, a steady anchor, double-checking the tactical plan and giving Ethan a brief, silent nod of solidarity. Sophie, safe with Maria and Riley's partner, had clung to Ethan before he left, her small hand gripping his for dear life. "Please bring my mom back," she whispered. Ethan hugged her tight, whispering, "I promise. I'll do everything I can." The drive to the warehouse was a blur of flashing lights and adrenaline. Every muscle in Ethan's body vibrated with anxiety. The rain blurred the windows, streaking the world outside into a shifting palette of fear and hope. As they pulled up to the derelict lot, the tension became suffocating. Agents fanned out under the cover of darkness, radios chirping. Ethan could hear his own heartbeat, loud and wild, as he followed Riley toward the entrance. The air was thick with the scent of oil, rust, and wet asphalt. Suddenly, everything happened at once. Shouts, the crash of a battering ram, the blinding burst of tactical lights. Ethan pressed forward with the team, eyes straining to adjust, heart thundering. Inside, shadows darted between crates and old machinery. There was a moment of chaos, yells, scuffling feet, doors slammed shut, the sharp bark of a command. FBI. Nobody move. Rick moved like a force of nature, cutting off escape routes and clearing rooms with grim efficiency. Ethan's world narrowed to a single focus, the locked room from Sophie's drawings. He followed Riley to a metal door, heard a muffled cry from within. Riley called for a bolt cutter. The seconds felt like hours. Finally, with a metallic shriek, the door gave way. Inside, blinking in the harsh light, was a woman, disheveled, eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. For a moment she seemed not to recognize anyone. Then her gaze landed on Riley's badge. "Please, my daughter, Sophie, is she alive?" The words tumbled out in a ragged gasp. Ethan stepped forward, voice breaking. "She's safe. She's waiting for you. You're going home." Tears flooded the woman's face. Elena, Sophie's mother. She stumbled into Ethan's arms, sobbing, barely able to stand. "Thank you. I thought I'd never see her again. I prayed every night. Please let her be safe." Her words dissolved into tears. Ethan held her, overcome by the enormity of her relief and the reality of what she'd survived. Outside, the raid continued. Agents cuffed men in dark jackets, Mr. Green among them, sullen and silent. Rick made sure Ethan and Elena were hustled to safety. The chaos of the moment faded into the background as Ethan helped Elena into a waiting ambulance. She gripped his hand, whispering, "You saved us. Please, take care of Sophie if anything happens to me." Back at the penthouse, Sophie was waiting, pale with worry, hands twisting in her lap. When Ethan stepped through the door, guiding Elena beside him, Sophie's breath hitched in her chest. For a second, no one moved. Then, with a cry that sounded both wounded and wild with joy, Sophie threw herself into her mother's arms. They clung to each other, sobbing and laughing, the trauma of months and years spilling out in a flood of relief. Elena pressed kisses to Sophie's tangled hair, whispering, "I never stopped looking for you." Never. Sophie's voice, muffled by tears, answered, "You found me, Mommy. You really found me." Ethan watched, heart swelling, tears stinging his eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt the true meaning of sacrifice, the fear, the risk, the sleepless nights, and understood why people called it love. Rick stood behind him, arms folded, eyes suspiciously wet. Maria hugged both mother and daughter, whispering prayers of gratitude. Later that night, as the city glowed quietly outside and rain slid down the windows, Ethan tucked Sophie into bed. Elena sat beside her, stroking her hair. The penthouse was filled with the soft sounds of reunion. Low voices, the creak of the mattress, the occasional giggle between tears. As he turned out the light, Sophie looked up at him, eyes shining. "Will you stay tonight, Ethan? Just until I fall asleep?" He nodded, sitting in the armchair across from her bed, letting the weight of exhaustion finally settle. He listened as Sophie and Elena drifted off together, voices blending in quiet whispers. The world beyond their windows remained dark and uncertain, but inside, hope had found a foothold, and Ethan knew that whatever storms still waited, they would face them together. Weeks passed in a haze of medical appointments, police interviews, and sleepless nights. Elena and Sophie were home, but the trauma still clung to them, showing itself in nightmares and flinches at sudden noises. Yet each day, the penthouse felt warmer, more alive, a place where sunlight lingered longer and laughter sometimes drifted down the hall. For Ethan, life had shifted in ways he couldn't have imagined. Business calls went unanswered, meetings were missed, and none of it seemed to matter anymore. His world, once defined by achievement and distance, had become smaller, but infinitely richer. The city buzzed with the news of the arrests. The press swarmed the courthouse steps as the trial of Mr. Green and his accomplices began, their faces splashed across every channel and headline. The FBI and Child Protection Services worked to keep Sophie and Elena safe and out of the spotlight. But the gravity of the case meant testifying was unavoidable. The court ordered partially closed proceedings for Sophie's testimony, allowing only essential personnel in the room and shielding her from the defendant's direct gaze. Sophie was terrified, but with Ethan and Agent Riley by her side, she found a quiet, determined bravery. Elena's hand never left hers as they sat together in a small, wood-paneled courtroom. When Sophie took the stand, the entire room fell silent. She sat in her blue dress, clutching a small drawing she had made of her family reunited, her hands trembling only a little. The prosecutor spoke gently, asking simple questions. Sophie answered, her voice clear but soft, describing the nights locked in the dark, the fear of footsteps outside the door, and the relief when the police burst in. At one point, the prosecutor held up Sophie's drawing for the court to see. "Can you tell us what this picture means to you?" he asked. Sophie nodded, her eyes shining. "It means I'm not alone anymore." Mr. Green sat at the defendant's table, expression cold, refusing to meet her gaze. His lawyers argued, tried to dismiss Sophie's memories as confused and unreliable, but the evidence was overwhelming. Surveillance footage, documents, and the testimony of the other rescued children. When Elena took the stand, her voice was steady, but her hands shook as she described the threats, the captivity, and the hope that one day she would see her daughter again. After days of wrenching testimony and legal arguments, the judge delivered his verdict. The courtroom was packed with reporters, child advocates, and families whose lives had been touched by the case. The judge's voice was firm and unwavering as he pronounced, "This court will not allow your evil to go unpunished. Justice will be served for every child you hurt." He sentenced Mr. Green to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Each of his accomplices received long sentences of their own. A ripple of emotion moved through the courtroom. Tears, relief, and even applause as the gavel fell. Outside, Elena and Sophie embraced Ethan and Riley, the four of them forming a tight, silent circle on the courthouse steps. Sophie looked up at Ethan, her eyes still wet with tears, but alight with hope. "Is it over?" she whispered. Ethan knelt, squeezing her hand. "The worst is over, sweetheart. You're safe. You're free." In the weeks that followed, Ethan helped Elena and Sophie move into a sunlit apartment not far from the bay. He sat quietly with them as they picked out furniture, a new bed for Sophie, a table for family dinners, a small pot of daisies for the window ledge. Sophie chose yellow curtains for her room and a blue paint for the walls. The apartment was modest, but it radiated possibility and peace. Ethan made sure all the bills were handled quietly, never asking for thanks. Maria began volunteering at the new foundation Ethan set up to help child trafficking survivors. Rick took on the role of security director, his gruff exterior hiding a deep affection for Sophie. Agent Riley, now a family friend, visited often for dinner and helped Elena navigate the logistics of their new life. One evening, after sharing a meal of homemade soup and fresh bread, Sophie turned to Ethan. "Can we do this every week? All of us together?" Ethan smiled, a genuine open smile that felt strange and wonderful on his face. "I'd like that more than anything." That night, as Sophie drew another picture, this one filled with sunshine, flowers, and 3 smiling figures holding hands, Ethan realized how much had changed. The ghosts of the past would never fully vanish, but new memories were already blooming in their place. For the first time in years, he looked at the future not with fear or resignation, but with cautious, unbreakable hope. Spring arrived quietly in San Francisco, bringing a gentle gold to the mornings and the sweet scent of blossoming trees to the city's battered sidewalks. The fog still rolled in most days, but inside Elena and Sophie's apartment, sunlight painted everything a little brighter. The living room window overlooked the bay. Sometimes, if she stood on her tiptoes, Sophie could see the ferries gliding past, their wakes shining like silver ribbons. Life settled into a new, steady rhythm. The nightmares faded, though some nights Sophie still woke, gasping for breath, the echoes of old fears chasing her into consciousness. On those nights, Elena would curl beside her in bed, stroking her hair and whispering lullabies until Sophie's breathing slowed. Sometimes, Sophie would ask Elena to leave the door cracked open, just in case. "So I know I'm really safe," she'd say, and Elena would promise that she always was. Ethan became a constant in their world, not the distant, reserved CEO he once was, but a friend, a protector, and gradually, something like family. Every Saturday, he arrived with a bag of groceries and a stack of new books for Sophie. Sometimes he and Elena cooked dinner together, exchanging recipes and laughter, making small, gentle mistakes in the kitchen. Burned toast, too much garlic, not enough salt. These ordinary mishaps became treasures, woven into the fabric of their new life. Maria, whose kindness had first bridged the gap between Ethan and Sophie, was now a fixture at Ethan's foundation. She greeted every child who walked through the doors with the same warm smile she'd once offered a frightened little girl at a diner. Rick, the ever-watchful guardian, kept a close eye on the security cameras and an even closer eye on the kids, becoming a favorite uncle among the staff. Agent Riley visited often, bringing news from the outside world and a steady, reassuring presence. One afternoon, as sunlight poured across the living room, Ethan arrived to find Sophie painting by the window. She wore an old t-shirt spattered with blues and yellows, her tongue poking out in concentration as she added a final splash of color to her canvas. "Is that us?" Ethan asked, smiling as he knelt beside her. Sophie nodded, holding up the picture with pride. It showed 3 figures, herself, Elena, and Ethan, holding hands under a sky filled with swirling, hopeful light. In the corner, a small flower pot with the word "Hope" painted on it sat on a windowsill. "It's our family," Sophie said, her voice shy but sure. Ethan felt his throat tighten. For so long, his life had been a succession of empty victories, achievements that brought him little comfort. Now, watching Sophie's face glow with happiness, he understood just how much he'd been given. "You're the bravest person I've ever met, Sophie," he told her quietly. "You gave me back my life." Days grew longer and softer. On Sundays, Ethan and Sophie took walks in the park with Elena, sometimes bringing a picnic, sometimes simply watching the ducks in the pond. The 3 of them became a familiar sight: Elena's gentle laugh, Ethan's protective presence, Sophie running ahead with her arms outstretched like a bird discovering flight. Once, as the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the grass, Sophie reached for Ethan's hand with one of her own, and for Elena's with the other. They walked like that, 3 in a line, the world around them gentle and forgiving. One bright afternoon, as a light breeze swept in from the bay, they climbed a small hill overlooking the city. At the top, Sophie hesitated, then set her old, battered backpack on the grass. She looked at Ethan and Elena, her eyes shining. "Can I let it go?" she whispered. Elena knelt and hugged her tight. "You don't have to keep anything that hurts you," she said softly. Ethan nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "We're right here, Sophie." Always with trembling hands, Sophie opened the backpack, taking out the last of her old drawings, some dark, some filled with tears, others with hopeful suns peeking through clouds. She set them down, then zipped the bag closed for the final time. With a deep breath, she stood and tossed the backpack into the wind. It tumbled down the hill, caught for a moment in a gust before coming to rest at the bottom. Sophie watched it for a long moment, then turned back to Ethan and Elena. "I'm not scared anymore," she said, her voice quiet but strong. "Not as long as I have you and Mom." Ethan pulled her into a hug, tears stinging his eyes. "You're safe, sweetheart. We're a family now. That's forever." As the sun set behind them, casting long golden rays across the city, the three stood together, hands clasped, hearts finally at peace. In the distance, the lights of San Francisco blinked on one by one, each one a tiny promise that hope endures. Back at the apartment, laughter spilled out the open windows. Maria telling stories to the kids at the foundation, Rick and Agent Riley planning a community event, Elena humming as she watered the hope flower pot on the sill. The world beyond their door would always be uncertain, but inside, love and belonging had taken root. And for Ethan, whose life had once been defined by loneliness, nothing could have been more extraordinary. The story of a little girl in the rain had become a story of redemption, healing, and the unbreakable power of chosen family. A story that, in its quietest moments, changed them all forever. If this story touched your heart, even just a little, we invite you to stay with us. Because here at Restoring Tales, every story reminds us that love, kindness, and second chances still exist. There are more tales waiting, of resilience, of hope, and of quiet heroes among us. So, if you believe in the healing power of love and the beauty of life's small moments, be sure to subscribe to Restoring Tales and turn on notifications, because the next story might be the one your heart's been waiting for. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.